Hi, I'm Don Pizzette, co-founder and edutainer at ITProTV. We've curated a playlist of select episodes so you can get an idea of what it's like to choose ITProTV for your IT learning. It wasn't easy. There are more than 4,000 hours of IT training on ITProTV. Enjoy this episode and be sure to subscribe so you won't miss a thing.
Hello, and thank you for watching ITProTV, helping you learn everywhere you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus, Super User Privileges. That's what we are going to be talking about, or more specifically, that's what Don Pizzette's going to be talking about. Don, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. And yep, we're going to be talking about super user privileges. You know, when you install Linux, you're going to have a user account that you create for yourself, but it's just a regular user. There's also a default user called root, and that root user is the super user. They have super privileges and power. We need that power every now and then, and it's super tempting to log in as root, which you're not supposed to do for security reasons. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to take a look at some of the ways that we can act as the root user, that we can get super user privileges temporarily so that we can run certain commands. And this is really important for the whole setup of the rest of this series because there will be a number of commands where you need to be an administrator to run them. And then there's a number of commands that you can just be a regular old user to run. So that's what we're going to take a look at right here in this episode is how to run commands as the super user the right way.
So, Don, when do we need super user privileges?
All right, so typically it's going to be commands that either commands that affect the system as a whole or commands that affect a user other than your own. So for example, if I'm manipulating files in my home directory, those are my files. I can do whatever I want. Doesn't matter. I don't need to be a super user for that, right? But if I want to change the IP address on the network card, that's a system change. And so you need to be an administrator to perform that task. Or if I'm logged in as Don and I want to modify a file in your directory, in the Zach directory, well, that's your file. I don't have permission to that. I can't modify it unless I become the super user. Then I can modify whatever I want. So there's plenty of times, especially right after you install Linux, where you'll need to be that super user. You'll need to be somebody who can get in and modify settings and change values, assign IP addresses, and you have to do that. Now, in the graphical user interface, it'll usually have a way to manage that. And it'll prompt you for an administrator password. But from the command line, it's a lot more difficult. So what'll usually happen is you'll run some command, like here, let me just show you as an example here. So I'm just going to log in here as a regular user. And let's say I want to run a command like I want to delete a user account. And so I might do user del and specify a user. And when I run it, I get this message, right? Permission denied. I'm not allowed to do that, right? Because I'm not an administrator. And then I look at it and say, oh, okay, all right, well, I need to elevate my privileges and do it. So that's usually how we know that we need to do it because we get an error. But you'll learn over time which commands need to be an administrator, which commands don't need to be, and you can elevate your privileges when you need to, and then go back to being a regular user the rest of the time.
Well, what is the easiest way to access super user privileges?
You know, you'd be surprised. There's actually several different ways to do it. The recommended way is through a command called su. And I know su, it seems like super user, but it actually stands for substitute user. That it allows you to execute a command as another user. And the default form of su actually lets you log in as that user. So let me show you an example of how that works. So if I'm at a command prompt here and I type, who am I? Right? Who am I is a neat command because it shows you what user account you're logged in as. And you'd think to yourself, I know who I logged in as. What do I need a command for? But when you start doing things like substituting your user context, you can lose track. You can kind of forget who you're logged in as. So it's nice to do. And when I run it, I can see that I'm logged in as dpizzette. So I'm me, oddly enough.
Right? Yay.
Now let's say that I wanted to be a particular user. I've got this user John Doe. So I want to be John Doe. I want to run something as that user. I could type su followed by a username. Okay. And when I do that, it's going to ask me for John Doe's password. It's going to say, well, I mean, if you think you can be John Doe, what's his password? And then I can type that in if I know it. If I don't know it, I can't do it, right? But I'll type in John's password, and notice my command prompt changed. It said dpizzette before, now it says jdoe. And if I type who am I, I'm jdoe. I just substituted my user context for John Doe's user context. Now I'm operating as John or Joe or whatever his name is. And so I'm in here and I'm working, I'm doing whatever it is that I need to do. manipulating his files or whatever. And when I'm done, I can just type exit and see how my prompt changed back to dpossett. If I do a who am I can see that I am dpossett again. I've now exited out of that context. I'm no longer operating as John Doe. So I've just kind of switched back and forth. That's the easiest form of it. I usually go a little bit further though. If you do su and a hyphen followed by jdoe, when I ran it a moment ago, something happened that I didn't point out. It was kind of hidden by the prompt. So let me get back in here. Um, when the prompt changed, originally it said dpossett at localhost, and there was a tilde that let me know I was in my home directory. But when I switched to John, John, all right. So it says jdoe, so we know we're John at localhost. But notice how it's not a tilde anymore, right? I switched my user context, but I stayed right in the same directory I was already in. I was in /home/dpossett. And that's why that path changed. I'm not in my home anymore. I'm in somebody else's. I'm logged in as John Doe now. But if I do a PWD, I can see I'm in /home/dpossett. And if I start poking around in here, I get permission denied. I'm John Doe. I don't have access to Don's directory, right? So I've now switched identities. And that's because I didn't truly start a session as John. I kind of modified my existing session. That's why I stayed where I was. Let me do this a different way. I'm going to type exit. So I'm back to being Don Possett. And this time, when I do su jdoe, I'm going to add a hyphen. And there's spaces on both sides of it. So it's su space hyphen space jdoe, right? And when I run that, it's going to ask for a password. And notice the prompt has a tilde in it this time. And if I do a PWD, I can see I'm in /home/Joe. And also notice how it displayed the last login. Now I've actually created a login session. And I'm truly logged in as John Doe now in his directory, looking at his files. So this is called creating a session for that user. And when you don't do the hyphen, you don't do that. It's really modifying your session and you're becoming that user. Here, I'm fully that user while I operate inside of it. And when I exit, it's kind of like logging out. And so I see that logout message, and now I'm back to my own directory. So when we use su, we'll typically stick that hyphen in there. Now, John Doe is not an administrator. So switching to his context really doesn't give me any superpowers. It just allows me to modify his files. But if I want to change something on the system, right? So let's say I want to edit the host file for my system. So I want to override some DNS records. I could use an editor like Nano, and I'm going to edit /etc/hosts, right? And when I go to edit that file, look at the warning that I get down here at the bottom. Warning, no write permission. I'm just a regular user. I'm not allowed to edit that file. So that's the warning that I get. So if I did edit it, it wouldn't let me save, okay? I want to edit that file. I can't edit it. John can't edit it, but the administrator can. The default administrator account is called root. For every Linux distro that's out there, that's always called root. The account might be disabled by default, and there might be an additional account, but there's always a root user created. If I want to take over the root identity, I could type su root and become the root user. I could honestly just type su, right? If you don't provide a username, it defaults to the root user. And I can do su hyphen to actually start a context as that, an actual login session as that user. So I'm going to do su hyphen. And that's probably the most common form of this command, is saying, look, I just want to be root for a little while. And when you do that, you can provide the root user's password. And now I'm switched over and I'm logged in as root. If I do a who am I can see that I am root. And now if I do nano/etc/hosts, I don't get a warning about it being write only. In fact, I can come in here and add an entry. So I'm going to override ITProTV and point it to 1.1.1.1. And I can set that in there. When I save it, it'll let me save, and I just made an administrative change. So that's an example of where I would need to become an administrator in order to get in and make a change. And it's super important to remember, now that I'm done, I need to get out of that context. I need to type exit to get out of it, because otherwise every other command I type is going to be run as root. And if I accidentally launch some malicious software, it would now have full administrative privileges across my system. That would be really bad. So you want to get in there, run the commands you need to run, and then get out. Don't stay in another user's context any longer than you have to.
Well, what if I just want to perform a single command?
All right, so the mistake I made here, or I could have made here, is that I'm actually switching into another user's context, right? And I'm staying there until I type exit. But if we just want to run one command, I just want to run one thing, right? We can actually tell the system to do that. Run as this alternate user, run as the root user, and once you're done, switch back. Just switch back quickly, okay? And the way we can do that the easiest is by using a command called sudo, sudo. And this one actually stands for super user do. So we're telling the super user to do something and be done with it. So if I come in and I say, who am I, right? I'm dpossessed. And I know that if I edit /etc/hosts, I'm going to get that warning that I don't have write permissions. So if I just want to get in and modify that file one time, right, and I want to do it as the super user, I could type sudo, so super user do, and then the command that I want to run. All right. And actually here, let me use the who am I command. So when I run who am I see that I'm dpossessed. If I do sudo who am I, it's going to prompt me for the password for the super user for root. And so I'll provide that password, and then it's going to run who am I, and it runs it, and it says, oh, you're root. But now if I run who am I, I've already flipped back to my regular context. I ran the one command, got in and out, and it's done. So that's a much better way to do things because I won't forget to exit because it's already exited for me. We just got in and ran it, and that was that. Now, it does cache the password. So for, I believe, 5 minutes is the default. So if I do another sudo who am I, see how it didn't ask me the password? Or if I were to do sudo nano /etc/hosts, it didn't ask me the password. And that's because it's just remembering I've already authenticated. But after 5 minutes, it's going to say, okay, nope, you're done. Now you got to re-authenticate. So, I might have walked away from the keyboard. Somebody else runs up to my computer. I don't want them just being able to super user everything. Then I'll have some real problems there. So that basically gets that kind of set up to be able to run the command, get in, get out, and be done with our day. So throughout this series, you'll see me use the sudo command a lot. I actually very rarely use su. If I know that I need to run 15 or 20 commands, then I'll actually use su to switch context because I just get tired of typing sudo every time for all those commands. But if it's just one or two things, I'll sudo them in and out. That's the safe bet, and that's what you'll usually want to do.
So, Don, besides you, who is allowed to use the sudo command?
We say besides you might not even be allowed. You're not necessarily sure. So it actually has restrictions in place on who is allowed to use the sudo command. And you cannot count on a distro allowing you to use it. In fact, there's several distros where your default user that you create does not have access to the sudo command. So there's actually a file that keeps track of who's allowed to use sudo. We can see it. It's inside of /etc. If you poke around inside of the etc folder, you'll find a file in there called sudoers, and it is right here. So sudoers are people that are allowed to use sudo. Sudo.
Sudoers.
Right. So these are the people that are allowed to do it. And inside of that file, it will define who is allowed to run it. Now, if I try and edit that file, I obviously don't have access, but it's kind of funny. I can use sudo to call an editor and edit the sudoers file.
That's right.
Now, let me give you a word of caution. If you make a mistake in there, if you screw something up inside of the sudoers file, you could make it where you're no longer able to use the sudo command. Now, that doesn't sound too bad because we could just log in as root and fix it, right? Well, there are some distros where the root user is disabled by default, so you can't log in as root. And if you damage the sudoers file, you might end up locking yourself out of the machine and no longer have administrative access to your own machine. So you need to be super careful when you're messing with the sudoers file. In fact, it's such a big problem that they recommend that you don't directly edit the sudoers file with a normal editor. They have a special editor that we can use that allows us to modify that file that does syntax checking specifically for the sudoers file. So I mentioned in a earlier show, there's a text editor called Vi, or V-I-V, you can pronounce it however you want. But Vi is included in basically every Linux distro that's out there. So I could vi /etc/sudoers like that and edit it. Actually, I would need to sudo this to be able to have permission to edit it, right? And then I could go in and start to modify that file. But if I make a mistake in here, it takes effect right away. I could end up breaking things, right? So instead, let me get out of that. We can do where we run a program called, actually, I don't even need this, called vi sudo. All right. This is going to run a special version of vi. It's actually the same version of vi, but configured differently, that is specifically set to edit the sudoers file. When you run vi sudo, it's going to edit that file. And when you go to exit, it's going to check the syntax and look for mistakes. And if it finds a mistake, it won't let you save. That way you don't overwrite the file with something bad. It ensures that you have a good copy. So if I were to go in and edit, so here I am editing this file, I go in and I change something. If you look, it's a little intimidating. There's a lot of stuff in here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I mess this up in some way, if I come in and type something that just doesn't work, or I put in a bad context or something. Hang on, let me get into the So there we go. Get into insert mode. And I start kind of messing with this, or I add something that doesn't make any sense. Then when I do that, if I try and save, it's going to check. And if I did something that would break sudo, then it's going to warn me about it. And what I did didn't cause enough damage. So I would have to do something that actually broke it. But it's a way to double check, right? So that's important that we do that, because we don't want to end up locked out of our own system. So when it comes to figuring out who's allowed to edit sudo or to use sudo, or if we want to change who's allowed to use sudo, we need to use that vi sudo command so that we can edit it. And when you go into that file, you'll see exactly who's allowed to use it. Now, most of the lines in here have a pound symbol before them. That means they're commented out. They don't do anything, right? So you can kind of ignore any line that has a pound symbol at the beginning, but it's inline documentation. It's teaching you how this file works. But as you scroll down, you'll find lines that don't have a pound symbol, and those are the ones that are allowed. So for example, those are just default settings there. Let me find the actual users here. Root. Root is a user, and root is being given the ability to run all commands from any host on this machine. So they have all privileges right there. The root user is allowed to do it. And then %wheel. When you see a percent, that means it's a group. So there's a group called wheel, and anybody in the wheel group is allowed to use all the commands with sudo, and so they've got that privilege. So on this particular system, those are the two things that allow it. Now, I was allowed to run sudo, but I don't see my name in here. My user account is dpossett. I'm not in this file. So how did I get access? Well, I'm not root, so I must be in that wheel group. And let me just jump out here and check. I'm going to do a groups dpossett. And I can see I am indeed in the wheel group. The installation, when I installed CentOS, it put me in the wheel group, so I didn't do that, right? But if you've created new accounts since then, they aren't in the wheel group. They won't be allowed to use sudoers. So that's definitely something you got to kind of plan for as you get all this stuff set up. But if I wanted to add myself specifically, right? Maybe I didn't want to put myself in the wheel group. I could go back into that vi sudo command, go down and find towards the end. The file is processed from the top down, so each line overrides the lines that precede it. So anytime you make a change to this file, you usually want to do it all the way at the bottom. And with vi sudo, you can scroll all the way down to the end, and you can just hit O, and that's going to add a line down here at the bottom. And I can add in a user. So I want me, so I'll say dpossett, and I want to be able to run commands, but I'm not necessarily going to be logged in locally. I might be SSHing in from another host. So I'm going to say that I can be on any workstation I want. So I'll say all, any workstation, and I want to be able to run all commands, right? And then for those commands, I do need to authenticate, so I'll add the third all there. That's the way the syntax works. I might want it so that when I run commands, I don't have to provide the root password, right? If you have to type the root password every time, that gets a little annoying. So I could come in and say no passwd : all on that last one, which we see an example of with that wheel group up here, where people in the wheel, actually that was commented out, so that wouldn't apply anyway, where they wouldn't have to provide the password when they ran the sudo command. They've already authenticated when they logged in, so now they'd just be able to run it without providing a password. But I can set that up right here, and once that's in place, now I specifically will be allowed to come in and run that. And the change takes effect right away. I'm going to hit escape to get out of the insert mode. I'll do :WQ. That's going to write the file and then quit out of vi sudo. It's going to check it for errors, and as long as it passes, there it is, it's in place. And so now I'm in the list, and even after the password ages out, it's not going to require me to re-enter that password. I can use sudo whenever I want.
So what would it look like if we only wanted to grant access to a few commands, Don?
That's something that may come up, right? Maybe I want to allow the IP command. The IP command is really useful because you can assign IP addresses to a network adapter.
Hmm.
So maybe I want to give Zach the ability to run the IP command with sudo, but no other commands. I don't want him editing files or doing other crazy things like that. You can actually restrict which commands somebody's allowed to run. So if I go back into sudo, let me pull that back up. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom. Most of the examples that you see will have this all, right? Which is basically saying we're allowing all commands to be run.
Hmm.
But it doesn't have to be like that. Look at this example right here. %users. That's the users group. And in this scenario, they're saying they can run from any host and then equals. And instead of granting all commands like I did down here, they're saying they can run mount and unmount. And not just mount and unmount, but a specific directory. They can mount /mnt/cd-rom and they can unmount /mnt/cd-rom, right? So they can't mount in any other folder. It's got to be that one folder. So they're being very specific. And that's a really cool thing that we can do. In order to do that, we do need to know where the command exists. So, where that command is found. And in my case, I said I was going to do the IP command. I actually don't know where it is. So let me do a which IP, which is a cool command because it'll tell you where that command actually exists. So I can see now the IP command is in /usr/sbin/IP. So that's good. And now I can go back into sudo and I can come in and I can find Zach. And maybe I want Zach to be able to view IP addresses and so on. So I can add to the list here. I'll just say Zach or whatever his username happens to be. All equals, and then the commands that I want to grant him separated by commas. So maybe I want him to have /user. Actually, it was a smarter me would have just copied it, but it was /user/sbin/IP, I believe is where it was. And then I could also do a comma and say I want him to have /user/sbin/ifconfig or whatever other command that I want. I would lay out each one that I wanted him to have. And by putting that in there, I'm making sure that he only has that minimum access, right? You never want to give people more privilege than they need to perform commands. And once that's defined, now he would be able to run sudo IP or sudo ifconfig, and it would allow that, but he wouldn't be able to run sudo sudo, right? He wouldn't be able to run that one because it's not in his authorized list of commands. And I could have done this with a group just the same. The only difference would be the group name would have a percentage sign before it to designate that it is a group. But at that point, it would be available, and then that user would be able to use those commands.
Well, are there any shortcuts or aliases to help with all this?
It depends on the distro. Some have additional shortcuts.
Mhm.
I don't use them myself because you can't count on them always being there. So, for example, I end up having to edit a lot of files using sudo, right? And so I end up doing sudo and then vi or sudo nano, whatever, and then pointing. So it's something I do a lot. There's an alias. Let me get out of this. There's an alias on a lot of systems called sudoedit, where you can run sudoedit and point at a file like /etc/hosts, and it will launch whatever your default editor happens to be, and then it will open up that file. Well, my default editor is Vi, and so this works, right? Takes me right in there, and now I'm at administrative privileges. I'm not getting that warning about not having access, right? It took me right in. But in my case, I use Vi. If I type sudo Vi and then the file, it's actually one keystroke less. So this alias takes a little more work for me. But if you use Nano or some other editor, maybe you have gedit set as your default, which is the graphical editor. Well, you can have it set as your default so that when sudoedit runs, it automatically launches that other editor. And now you get you save a couple of keystrokes and get there. I can't tell you that that's always going to be there, though. So it depends on which distro you're running. So you have to take a look at the documentation, take a look at what's in your /user/bin and /user/sbin folders and see what you spot there. And then you also have the alias command that if you run it, it'll show some other aliases that are a part of your user account. And so you might find some aliases in there that tie things together. I actually don't see any of mine that stand out here. But those are all different places you want to look to find out what you've got on your system. But it certainly does vary.
Super user privileges, another wonderful episode inside the CompTIA Linux Plus series. Don, I think you have something else you'd like to say, yeah?
With all these commands, you need to be careful, right? It's all about giving people minimum access. It's very easy to say, you know what, I want Zach to be able to run this one command, so I'm just going to give him access to everything, right? Or I'll just throw him in the wheel group. That's easy, right? But now he could potentially damage things just by accident, not necessarily intentional. So you need to follow the principle of least privilege, where you give people specifically what they need, and that's it. And sudo allows you to do that. Su does not. With Su, I would need to give Zach the root password. Here's the password for that root account. Well, he could just log in as root instead of logging in as himself. And when he does that, he could carry out a bunch of commands, and my logs wouldn't help me at all because it would show that it was the root user that did it. I wouldn't know. Was that Zach? Was that me? That's not a good thing to do. Sudo is far, far better on that. So definitely leverage that command. That needs to be part of your regular routine.
Thank you, Don. Well said. Good advice. Hey, and here's some more good advice. Watch every episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. You're going to be so glad you did when that exam comes rolling along, and it is inevitable. And by the way, don't forget about the supplementary information inside of our course library that will help you do only one thing, be even more successful. Check that out as well. And tell everybody you know about ITProTV. ITProTV is binge-worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.